Welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and today I'm speaking with Emily Milliken from the N7 Initiative to discuss the legacy of the Abraham Accords and also the importance of the Abraham Accords in President Trump's second term in office. Of course, a lot has happened since President Trump's historic breakthrough with the Abraham Accords from his first term in office. The October 7th attacks and the subsequent war to follow greatly changed the calculus not only of the Abraham Accords, but of Israel's relationship with many of its regional Arab nations, namely Saudi Arabia. One of the preconditions for Israeli Saudi normalization has always been an answer to the Palestinian question. And of course, since the start of that war, that negotiation or that calculus has been greatly complicated. So today, Emily's going to break down the Abraham Accords, what they might look like in President Trump's second term, and some of the hurdles and obstacles following October 7th to expanding and fully realizing the Abraham Accords. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Emily Milliken, welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm so excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, we're going to talk about Israel and its normalization with some members of the Arab world and hopes for expanding the Abraham Accords under Trump's second administration. And this is really in line with what you work on at the N7 Initiative. So, I thought maybe you could just introduce yourself and the work that your organization does.
Yeah, so my name is Emily Milliken. I work at the N7 Initiative, which is a partnership between the Atlantic Council, which is a think tank, and the Jeffrey M. Talpins Foundation. And I joined the N7 Initiative over the summer after spending about 4.5 years running a Middle East defense consulting firm that provided open source intelligence for military officials in the Gulf. The N7 initiative was founded shortly after the Abraham Accords were signed. It's really meant to fill the gaps left by the US government in how to promote Arab Israeli normalization and then also regional integration at large. So we are focused on building relationships between Israel and other Arab and Muslim countries in the Middle East and beyond, but also building relationships between these Arab and Muslim countries themselves.
Mm.
There's a severe lack of things like free trade agreements, defense cooperation agreements within the Middle East and within Arab and Muslim countries themselves.
Mm.
We get to, work with governments in the region to come up with real policies that they can do to make it easier for them to work together in a variety of areas. And we have continued to do that throughout the war unabated.
Mm. That's incredible. Has the war at all complicated or changed kind of the calculus and how you approach encouraging that integration, or has the war, at least as far as helping the Arab world integrate together, kind of not really played an obstacle or a factor in that?
So for us at N7 specifically, it's really changed the way that we engage with these leaders. So prior to October 7th, we were really focused on these large scale conferences that bring together leaders from around the world to talk about these actual policies, to come up with recommendations that then we would give to the Negev Forum and the Negev Forum's working groups. And those were really successful. We actually hosted the very first ever ministerial level meeting of all the Abraham Accords countries, as well as the United States and Jordan and Egypt. So, all the countries that have normalized relations with Israel. And
Amazing.
now that, once the war started, there was a lot of reticence about meeting in public and doing something so big that we have shifted to doing more quiet diplomacy. Like we go to big conferences and we host these sideline dinners and sideline events for these leaders to kind of meet up. And that way they have a level of plausible deniability. We were already there and they get to still talk. We've really noticed that the relationships have continued on with no issue. These people have reached working agreements and they like each other and they know each other well. The war has just complicated things on a public and public diplomacy level.
Mm. And if you don't mind me asking, why do you think that is? Is it pressure from the West? Is it kind of the stigma of normalizing with Israel within the Arab world that drives that hesitancy to be more public about it?
I think it's a lot of pressure from actually domestic audiences, especially when you look at places like Jordan and Egypt that are so close to Israel, and Jordan also hosts so many people of Palestinian descent. And so it's really unpopular with the populace right now in a way that it wasn't before. You know, while all these people from Arab and Muslim countries, they really connect with Palestinians. They have a shared, religion or shared background or shared heritage. A lot of people around the Muslim world are from, what they consider to be Palestinian origins.
Mhm.
And so it's difficult on that level, but for the governments, they're still very interested in things like, joint security agreements, joint economic agreements. Trade has continued unabated between Abraham Accords countries and Israel, and actually has done really well.
Mm, that's so interesting. I would love to get your take on kind of Trump's suggestion that Jordan play an increased role with Gaza as far as like the domestic pressure or maybe pushback from that. But first, I just want to talk about, what the Abraham Accords are, what their aim is to achieve, and what member states are a part of that before we get into some of the bigger regional questions like Saudi Arabia and if they'll join.
Yeah, so the Abraham Accords was started. It first was Israel, UAE, and Bahrain who joined together. And it's a series of agreements where they normalize relations in exchange for a wholesale different things, everything from security cooperation to flights between each other's countries. Later on, we had Sudan join, which is obviously a little bit difficult now, given that the government that's in Sudan now is not the government that signed the Abraham Accords. And Morocco also technically has its own agreement, but is widely considered part of the Abraham Accords. At N7, we also work with Egypt and Jordan that have their own agreements with Israel as well, but are not part of the Abraham Accords.
Mm. And I know Saudi Arabia was looking to join, or there was rumors, in DC at the end of Trump's first term, as we then went into the Biden administration's first and only term, on if they would join or if they would normalize. And then that kind of morphed into conversations about Saudi Arabia looking for a security pact with the United States, with normalizing with Israel as part of maybe the conditions for that security pact. And then October 7th happened. But what did that, Saudi Israeli relationship look like pre October 7? And then maybe how has that changed since?
Yeah, so the Saudi Israeli relationship was really growing very quickly but quietly during the Trump administration and even in the early Biden administration before October 7th. During that time, their rapprochement was really fueled more so by shared concerns over Iran's malign influence in the region than any other, desire. And there was all these ongoing conversations about, would Saudi join the Abraham Accords? Would they have their own similar agreement? And that kind of was continuing on. During this time, we had Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman making public statements saying that Saudi saw Israel as a potential partner instead of an enemy. And this is just such a major departure from, previous statements in previous years. But the government in Riyadh has always been really, really clear that they see some progress on Palestinian statehood as a prerequisite for normalization with Israel. Preferably, they want it to be in line with the Arab Peace Initiative, which was their own proposal that they sent up to the Arab League in 2002, which would allow for a wholesale Arab Israeli normalization in exchange for a whole list of different things. Was rejected by the Israeli government at the time that was led by Ariel Sharon because it would have required Israel to withdraw the pre 1967 borders. But, the Israeli government has kind of waffled on that a bit since then. In 20, I think 16, Netanyahu said he was considering it. In 2018, he said he wasn't considering it. So I do think that there's a bit of, workaround on, working room for both sides.
Hmm.
Um, Prior to the tragedies on October 7th, Saudi and Israeli officials were engaging in security and intelligence cooperation behind the scenes, particularly on Iran. And right before the Hamas attack, there was talks on normalization. They had intensified, and MBS had given another interview that said that those relationships they were getting close to normalization, and there was even reports that the US-backed security agreement was being negotiated in exchange for security guarantees and weapon sales, that they would normalize relations. I would characterize the current relationship post October 7th as still, covertly strong, but it has more difficulties now. It has more sensitivities, right? And what has happened is really intensified that requirement that the Saudis have for, progress on a Palestinian state. It's made it even more important to them.
Mhm. So, what are some of the spoilers to Saudi-Israeli normalization? Would, the Palestinian question be that number one spoiler? I know that that was maybe a large motivating factor for the October 7th attacks was, an attempt to spoil any potential normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But are there other maybe preconditions in addition to the Palestinian question?
Yeah, so I think some of the real conditions that they've set aside, that need to happen is also, they want reconstruction. And we'll probably have to see the Gaza ceasefire advance into the second stage, which would require 33 Israeli hostages to be released before then. And a ton of aid needs to go into Gaza. And the ceasefire in Lebanon would probably also need to hold. But, there's so many spoilers and things that could happen. There could be things like issues within the Israeli government because there are so many of them that are opposed to Palestinian statehood. So there's these two things that are really working against each other. There's also questions about, whether or not Israel will roll back its outposts in, like on the borders of Syria and Lebanon. And there's also issues like the Houthis. The Houthis could play a major role as a spoiler, especially because they have been launching attacks against Israel and maritime traffic. They've paused right now for a period of time. It's unclear how long they'll continue to do that. But if there are more chatter about a potential Saudi-Israeli deal, the Houthis could ramp up attacks again in an attempt to be a spoiler, to combat Israel, to combat the United States, and really show up as this new, they're asserting themselves as a main ally of Iran.
Mhm.
Then obviously the Palestinian question, especially after Trump's statement regarding his desire to take over the Gaza Strip, it's definitely the biggest potential spoiler. It was that statement was quickly rejected by a lot of Arab leaders, including Saudi Arabia, which really the Saudi leaders really came forward and clarified that their position on the need for a Palestinian state was non-negotiable, and that they wouldn't establish any diplomatic relations with Israel unless that goal was met. But we have seen, one statement doesn't give us a full picture of what Trump really means there. And after his statement, we did get clarifications from members of his staff that the administration, has not committed to using US troops to clear territory in the Gaza Strip, and that any relocation of Palestinians would just be temporary. They would be allowed to return. A lot of people have been speculating that this could be a starting point for negotiations on a post Gaza situation, and that, they're looking to use this as a way to get an upper hand in negotiations with Arab states about
Mhm.
what a new Gaza would look like.
Mhm. And if you don't know the answer to the question I'm about to pose, feel free to pass on it. But as you mentioned, just some of the domestic pressure within Jordan, what, just from your understanding of that population, the demographics, and some of their political attitudes, what do you think their attitude towards Trump's proposal would be? Is it just like a complete rejection and like a non starter? Or do you think many Jordanians would be open to either housing Palestinians? You mentioned that they have some kinship or maybe even identify as Palestinian themselves. Do you think that would ever, play a role? Or do you see the suggestion for, America annexing Gaza in some way as kind of a non-starter just because of the myriad of complicated, even logistical dynamics that that would mean?
So the Palestinian question with Jordan is really difficult. When I lived in Jordan back in college, I went to visit these places that were Palestinian refugee camps that had been established for years and years and still had so many thousands of people living there. And so when it comes to Jordan and what role it would play, I don't think that the Jordanian government would be willing to accept any sort of agreement where they would be taking in additional Palestinians. And this is for a multitude of reasons. One of the big ones being, they already have so many. It's a population issue. They have over 50% of their population is of Palestinian descent. And this is not something that they are willing to really acknowledge because it's an issue for them, and it controls a lot of what public opinion says. And so to accept more is an issue. They're also housing Syrian refugees, they're housing Afghan refugees, people from all over the world. And so they just, quite frankly, when it comes to public opinion, but also when it comes to the financial side of things, they just can't accept it. I do think that like Jordan does play a really outsized role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and will continue to do so. But when it comes to kind of bringing in more Palestinians, I'm very doubtful that they would be accepting of that, just because they still have active, what people call refugee camps, and there's issues with those. They try and make them nicer. They try and expand the roads, increase services. And that kind of never happens. And so the people are living in poverty in many cases, and not able to access services, not able to access, some of the better schools in Jordan. And so it's just really not feasible for them.
Mm. I also was hoping maybe you could, just for the audience too, because there's so many different actors and different countries, and they all have, different dynamic domestically, and then also with how they interplay with each other. One of the driving forces, from my understanding, of Saudi Arabia being interested in some sort of a US-led security pact or normalizing with Israel would be to counter the threat of Iran. And obviously, Iran has largely weakened since the start of the war, yet there's still a threat. Could you characterize for our audience, the dynamic between Iran and Saudi Arabia and what might lead Saudi Arabia to seek some sort of a security pact?
For sure. So right now, the war in Gaza, as well as the overthrow of the Saudi regime, we really shouldn't discount that as well. It's definitely weakened Iran's regional influence among its axis of resistance, which is a series of proxies and allies. Its proxies and allies in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza have been really weakened in many ways. And these guys have been forced to shift their focus from combating Israel and the United States and its allies, to reconstituting their forces, reconstituting their weaponry, and facing these major leadership and territorial crises where they don't have their leaders anymore. They don't have safe havens. And so we're really looking at that. But at the same time, Iran has these other smaller or lesser known, allies and proxies. Everybody knows Hezbollah and everybody knows Hamas. But there's also the Houthis in Yemen, and there's also Iranian proxies that are active in places like Bahrain. There's Iranian proxies that are constituted of Afghanis, and there's all these smaller ones as well, and they're kind of stepping up to fill the void, especially the Houthis. To show themselves as a leading role in the international world has been a big goal for the Houthis for a long time. And so when it comes to Saudi Arabia and looking at what kind of a security pact, even if these guys are weakened, it's still a long-term, strategic threat to Saudi Arabia. And the threat of the Houthis in Yemen is something that's right on their border. And as, the threat of other allies and proxies is reduced, Iran is putting a lot more effort into these smaller proxies like the Houthis, and sending them more weaponry, sending them more trainers, sending them more, parts to create their own weaponry. That's also really common. And they're also doing things like negotiating new deals for the Houthis to get advanced anti ship weapons from Russia. So we're seeing this on a large scale. We're seeing, Yemeni mercenaries active in Russia, and we're seeing, China and the Houthis, starting more relationships. And so even if the immediate threat of Hamas and the immediate threat of Hezbollah and, some of these Iranian proxies is quieted, it's still a major strategic threat for Saudi Arabia that has led it to want to seek out this strategic agreement, not only with the US, but also Israel, that has amazing intelligence, as we've seen through things like the Beeper attack and assassinations of people like Sinwar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I believe it was 2023, China helped normalize or renormalize relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Has anything really materialized from that? I haven't really seen much increased cooperation, but I know that that was a milestone or kind of a big um, breakthrough in the region's foreign policy at the time when that came to fruition.
Yeah, nothing major in the way that I think people really thought at the time.
Mhm.
There's a lot that goes into, these Iranian strategic agreements. For instance, Iran has a major strategic agreement with China that says they're
Mhm.
going to invest billions of dollars in each other's economies, and it just hasn't really come to fruition.
Mm.
Um, at the time there was things like Iran said it was going to, stop the Houthis from, targeting Saudi Arabia because they were targeting Saudi territory a lot at that time, and nothing had really come from that. There's also, a renormalization of relations between the UAE and
Mhm.
Iran. It's more so that these Gulf countries, especially, are interested in regional security and stability wholesale. And when there's been a bit of a step back from the United States and the region to as they want to focus on things like China and Russia, China was able to step in there and help broker that agreement with the Saudis. And the Gulf states in general feel like they need to step up themselves and have their own agreements with Iran. Even if they don't really mean anything at the end of the day, it reduces, the likelihood that Iran will actually target their
Mhm.
territory, especially.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So trying to increase some sort of interdependence, so the likelihood of some sort of retaliation will be lessened. I'm curious, just in closing, kind of we've seen some signaling from the Trump administration in their second term on regional policy. Obviously, the proposal to annex Gaza was quite shocking, just because it diverges so greatly from the status quo of the two-state solution in the region and what a lot of Arab states have, put forth as their stated policy objective when it comes to Israel. And then also, I know that President Trump just signed, I believe it was an executive order about Iran and increasing a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, but with the hopes to renegotiate for a nuclear deal. With some of these initial kind of steps or orders coming out from the Trump administration, do you think he will pursue re-engagement with the Abraham Accords and expanding the Abraham Accords in the region, or do we not really have enough kind of information at the start of this administration's term to really gather what the policy might be moving forward?
I definitely think that Trump is going to aim for a massive expansion of the Abraham Accords, with Saudi Arabia being, its first target.
Mm.
You have to really look at it as the Abraham Accords was undoubtedly one of the greatest foreign policy
Mm.
achievements of the first Trump administration. It really was something that no other president, will ever be able to replicate, as far as I know. And so then you had the Biden administration come in and said that they wanted to add Saudi Arabia to the Abraham Accords, that they wanted to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And they were not successful in doing that for a whole multitude of reasons. So I think Trump is really dedicated to wanting to bring more countries in, especially Saudi Arabia. And once Saudi Arabia comes, you'll definitely see other Muslim and Arab countries like Oman following suit. They're kind of waiting for the Saudis to take that first step. We also know that there have been negotiations with some countries that you wouldn't really expect outside of the region as well that are interested in normalizing relations. You have countries like Kosovo, you have countries like Azerbaijan, you have countries like Indonesia that are also Muslim or they're also Arab, and they're interested. They see the benefits that the Gulf countries have gotten out of these Abraham Accords, and they want in on that action. And I think that the Trump administration will really take advantage of that. And I think they're excited to join. And here at the N7 initiative, we are on the ground kind of meeting with a lot of these different actors in the private and in the public sector to see, what kind of preconditions do they need? What kind of groundwork can we lay to make the people there more accepting of an agreement if they're not already?
Mm. Well, it's amazing. It's amazing work that the N7 initiative is doing. Thank you so much, Emily, for helping kind of break down what is a very complex web of actors in the region and obviously hopes for the second Trump administration in their term. What work is N7 doing, and where can our audience follow that work? I know that you guys also have fellows. So where can our audience just follow along on the initiative that you guys are doing?
Yeah, our new website that is launching is the n7initiative.org. And we are really excited. We post scholarship there from our new N7 Research Institute from a range of people all over the region, outside of the region, former US government officials. We have some really exciting new fellows, like the first ever Israeli ambassador to the UAE, Amir Hayek, just joined us, and we're really excited to work with him. So, keep up with us there and also on Twitter. We are, all over the place. We're headed to Munich Security Conference to do some programming there for Middle Eastern leaders. We hope to resume our conferences soon. We're doing all sorts of exciting things.
Yeah, I'm blown away by all the work that you guys do. I find it to be very fascinating, and I think you have an incredible job. So, thank you for all the work that you do. And I don't know, do you have like a work handle on X or I call it Twitter, but
Yeah.
like an X account that you want maybe the audience can follow you on there or?
Yeah, they can follow me. It's at Emily, EMILYMPRZY.
Perfect. I'll put all the links to both N7 and your personal handle in the description box down below. Thank you so much for joining me, Emily.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of the Philos Project podcast. If you would like to learn more about the region, I encourage you to check out our Pathfinder courses, as well as follow the initiatives that N7 is doing at their website. I will link that in the description box down below. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.